Thomas Noguchi, the deputy medical examiner who performed Marilyn Monroe's autopsy on August 5, 1962, later became known as the coroner to the stars for his work on high-profile Hollywood death investigations, but his assistant during the Monroe autopsy, a young pathology resident named Edmond Locard, left the profession entirely within a year of Marilyn's death, telling colleagues that what he witnessed during that autopsy convinced him that the official findings were false. Locard remained silent for 60 years, honoring the confidentiality agreement he signed when he left the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office. But in 2018, following the death of Thomas Noguchi, Locard's sealed testimony was acquired by investigative journalists through a Freedom of Information Act request. That testimony reveals disturbing inconsistencies between what the autopsy actually found and what was reported in the official death certificate. According to Locard's account, when Marilyn's body arrived at the coroner's office on the afternoon of August 5th, it was wrapped in a sheet and placed on the examination table. When the sheet was removed, Locard immediately noticed that Marilyn was wearing what appeared to be a nightgown or robe. He described it as a light-colored silky garment, possibly pink or peach. This detail contradicted what he'd been told by scene investigators who had reported that Marilyn was found nude. Locard brought this discrepancy to Dr. Noguchi's attention. According to Locard's testimony, Noguchi examined the garment briefly and then removed it, setting it aside on a separate table. The garment was photographed as part of routine evidence documentation, but those photographs were never included in the official case file. During the external examination, Locard observed visible bruising on Marilyn's upper arms consistent with being grabbed or restrained, a small contusion on her lower back, and petechial hemorrhages in her eyes, tiny burst blood vessels that can indicate asphyxiation or strangulation. When Locard pointed out these findings and suggested they were inconsistent with a simple barbiturate overdose, Noguchi acknowledged the observations but stated that the injuries could have been sustained from falling while under the influence. Locard documented all of these findings in his autopsy notes with measurements and detailed descriptions, but when the official autopsy report was released, none of these injuries were mentioned. The report stated only that no significant trauma was observed on external examination. That nightgown, photographed during the autopsy but never entered into evidence, was last seen in the coroner's office on August 5, 1962. It has never been located, and according to Locard's testimony, that garment may have contained trace evidence, blood, bodily fluids, fibers from another person, that would have answered the question of what really happened to Marilyn Monroe in the hours before she died. Before we examine the evidence that was systematically removed from Marilyn's death investigation, if you're interested in uncovering the truth behind Hollywood's most famous cover-up, please subscribe to our channel. We investigate the sealed files and suppressed testimony they never wanted you to see. The official timeline of Marilyn Monroe's death begins with a phone call at approximately 4:25 a.m. on August 5, 1962, when LAPD received notification of a possible death at 123005 Fifth Helena Drive in Brentwood. But that official timeline has a problem. There was an earlier emergency call that was never included in investigation records, a call made nearly 30 minutes before police were notified. At 3:50 a.m., the Schaefer Ambulance Company received a dispatch for a medical emergency at the Fifth Helena Drive address. Ambulance driver Walter Schaefer and his partner Murray Leibowitz responded, arriving at the small bungalow within minutes. According to statements both men gave to their supervisor later that morning, statements discovered in the ambulance company's private files decades later and published by journalist Donald Spoto in 2006, Marilyn Monroe was not nude when they arrived. She was wearing what Schaefer described as a pink silk nightgown or maybe a robe, something expensive-looking, the kind of thing you'd expect a movie star to wear. Leibowitz corroborated this detail, also describing the garment as pink and silky. Both men were absolutely certain about this detail because it was unusual enough to register in their professional memory. The position of Marilyn's body was also different from what would later be described in official reports. Schaefer stated that Marilyn was not lying on her back with her hand reaching toward the phone. Instead, she was lying face down, her face turned to the left side, her arms at her sides. Her body was cool to the touch, and rigor mortis had begun, indicating she'd been dead for several hours. They attempted resuscitation for approximately 7 minutes before determining she was beyond help. But then 2 men who had been in another room came into the bedroom and told the ambulance crew they were doctors, that they'd already examined the patient and determined she was deceased, and that police and the coroner had been notified. The ambulance crew was told their services were no longer needed. When LAPD Sergeant Jack Clemmons arrived at the same address 45 minutes later, at approximately 4:35 a.m., the scene he encountered was dramatically different. Clemmons was met at the door by Eunice Murray, Marilyn's housekeeper, who led him to the bedroom where Dr. Ralph Greenson and Dr. Hyman Engelberg were standing. On the bed, arranged in what Clemmons would later describe as an unnaturally perfect position, was the body of Marilyn Monroe, completely nude, lying flat on her back with her arms at her sides and her legs extended straight, one hand reaching slightly toward the telephone on the nightstand. There was no pink nightgown. There was no clothing of any kind in the room. The bed linens appeared fresh and smooth, showing no signs of disturbance. The room was immaculately organized, with pill bottles neatly arranged on the nightstand, all labels facing forward. Clemmons had investigated enough death scenes to know immediately that something was wrong. This didn't look like a suicide. It looked like a stage set. In his official incident report filed later that morning, Clemmons documented his observations and noted that the scene appears to have been arranged post-mortem. But Clemmons knew something didn't add up. If Murray had discovered Marilyn at 3 a.m. and Dr. Greenson had arrived shortly thereafter, why hadn't police been called until after 4 a.m.? What had happened during that hour? The answer came decades later when Eunice Murray admitted in a 1985 BBC interview that the official timeline was false. Murray confessed that Marilyn had actually been discovered much earlier, around midnight, and that there had been a significant delay before authorities were notified because important people needed to be contacted first, and arrangements needed to be made. Murray never specified who these people were or what arrangements were being made, but her admission confirmed what Clemmons had suspected: the scene had been managed, controlled, and altered before law enforcement arrived. And the most significant piece of evidence removed from that scene was the pink nightgown that 2 trained medical professionals had seen on Marilyn's body less than an hour before police were called. Walter Schaefer and Murray Lebovitz filed their incident report with their ambulance company on the morning of August 5th, documenting clearly that Marilyn Monroe had been wearing a pink silk garment when they responded to the call at 3:50 a.m. The report was filed and should have been forwarded to the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office as part of standard death investigation protocol, but it wasn't. According to documents later obtained by researchers, the Schaefer Ambulance Company received a visit from LAPD detectives on August 6, requesting copies of all dispatch logs and incident reports related to the 5th Helena Drive call. The company provided the requested documents. Those documents were never seen again. When the coroner's office compiled their investigation file on Marilyn's death, there was no mention of an ambulance response, no record of the Schaefer Company dispatch, no documentation that anyone had attempted resuscitation before police arrived. Several weeks after Marilyn's death, Walter Schaefer was contacted by LAPD detectives and asked to come to the station to clarify details about his response. When he got to the part about the pink nightgown, one of the detectives stopped him and asked if he was certain. Schaefer said yes, absolutely certain. The detective then showed Schaefer the official coroner's report, which stated that Marilyn had been found nude. The detective suggested that perhaps in the stress of responding to a high-profile death call, Schaefer had misremembered seeing clothing on the body. According to Schaefer's later testimony to researchers, the detective then told him something that changed everything. Contradicting the official coroner's report could be problematic for his career, that it could raise questions about his professionalism, and that emergency services contracts with the city could be impacted. The message was clear: change your story or face consequences. Schaefer was a working man with a family to support. He was being given a choice: insist on what he'd seen and risk losing everything, or adjust his recollection to match the official narrative. Schaefer made the choice most people would make. He agreed that perhaps he had been mistaken, that perhaps the lighting had been poor, that perhaps what he'd thought was a pink nightgown was actually just the sheet draped over Marilyn's body. He signed a revised statement, omitting any mention of clothing. His partner Leibowitz made the same decision. Their original incident report disappeared from company files. The only reason we know about their original testimony is that Schaefer kept a personal copy at home, and after his death in 1991, his daughter found it and provided it to researcher Donald Spoto. Eunice Murray also gave at least 4 different versions of events over 40 years. In her final interview in 2005, just months before her death, Murray admitted that a lot happened that night that I was told to forget about, and confirmed that Marilyn was wearing a pink nightgown when I found her, and later it was gone. She confirmed the scene had been managed before police arrived and that items had been removed. When asked if she believed Marilyn had killed herself, Murray said, "I don't think she meant to die. I think something went wrong." When Dr. Noguchi opened Marilyn's stomach to examine its contents, he found it almost completely empty. No food particles, no pill residue, no partially dissolved capsules, nothing that would indicate recent oral ingestion of a large quantity of drugs. This was highly unusual. In cases of fatal barbiturate overdose from oral consumption, the stomach typically contains visible evidence, pill capsules in various stages of dissolution, characteristic discoloration of the stomach lining, irritation or burning of tissue. Marilyn's stomach showed none of these signs. It was clean, slightly contracted as if empty for many hours, with only a small amount of brownish fluid present. Dr. Noguchi documented this finding clearly in his dictation. Stomach contents notable for absence of expected pill residue despite reported ingestion of large quantity of barbiturates. Stomach lining shows no discoloration or irritation consistent with oral barbiturate consumption. He also examined Marilyn's intestinal tract thoroughly, looking for evidence that pills might have moved through the digestive system. Again, he found nothing significant. Noguchi dictated, small intestine and colon show no evidence of barbiturate residue. Finding is inconsistent with reported cause of death. Alternative delivery methods should be investigated. That phrase was crucial. Noguchi was indicating that if Marilyn had died from barbiturate overdose, the drugs had not entered her system through her mouth and digestive tract. The logical alternatives were injection or suppository. The toxicology report eventually showed extremely high levels of barbiturates in Marilyn's blood and liver levels that were absolutely fatal. But the absence of drugs in her digestive system created a medical puzzle. How did such massive quantities get into her body if not through oral ingestion? The official report never addressed this question. Standard protocol requires comprehensive photographic documentation in death investigations. Photos should be taken at the death scene during transport and during autopsy to create a permanent visual record. In Marilyn Monroe's case, photographs were taken at all stages, but almost none have ever been seen by the public or independent investigators, and many have disappeared entirely. The death scene photographs taken by LAPD photographer Jack Tobin should have documented exactly what condition Marilyn's body was in, what she was wearing, what position she was in. Those photographs were developed and reviewed by investigators. Then they vanished. When the case file was partially opened to researchers in 1985, the death scene photos were not included. In a 1982 interview, photographer Jack Tobin stated that his negatives had been seized by LAPD representatives and never returned, and that in his nearly 30 years as a forensic photographer, Marilyn's case was the only time his work had been confiscated rather than archived. The autopsy photographs should provide objective evidence of Marilyn's physical condition. According to Locard's testimony, extensive photographs were taken during autopsy. The pink nightgown was photographed in place before removal. It was photographed separately showing stains and condition. Marilyn's body was photographed showing bruising, the contusion on her back, and the petechial hemorrhages. All these photographs were developed, reviewed, and placed in the case file. But when the official case file was compiled for release, the autopsy photographs were not included. The coroner's office has consistently stated that photographic evidence from the Monroe autopsy is not available for public release due to sensitivity and privacy concerns. To understand why Marilyn Monroe's clothing at the time of her death became such a critical issue requiring cover-up, you have to understand the political context of August 1962. By summer 1962, Marilyn had been romantically involved with both President John F. Kennedy and his brother Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy. These weren't just rumors. The FBI had been monitoring Marilyn's phone calls and documenting her contacts with both men. FBI files confirmed that Marilyn had intimate relationships with both Kennedy brothers and that by mid-1962, those relationships had become problematic. Marilyn was reportedly hurt and angry about being used and discarded, and according to her psychiatrist, Dr. Ralph Greenson, she had been making threats to go public. When Marilyn died under suspicious circumstances on August 5th, the immediate concern for those protecting the Kennedys was damage control. If evidence suggested Marilyn's death was anything other than straightforward suicide, if there were signs of foul play, questions about who had been with her in her final hours, any indication of sexual activity around the time of death, it could open an investigation that would inevitably lead to questions about her relationships with the President and Attorney General. This is where the nightgown becomes crucial. If her body had been found clothed, it would support the narrative of a woman who had simply taken too many pills and died in her bed. But according to first responders and the autopsy assistant, that nightgown showed signs of staining, and Marilyn's body showed evidence of recent sexual activity and physical struggle. If that nightgown had been collected as evidence and analyzed, it would have revealed crucial information about what happened to Marilyn in the hours before death. It might have contained DNA evidence, fiber evidence showing contact with another person, or chemical evidence showing how drugs were introduced into her system. All of that would have raised questions that powerful people did not want raised. The solution was simple. Remove the nightgown before official investigators arrived, ensure first responders who saw it changed their statements to say Marilyn was found nude, and make sure autopsy photographs showing the nightgown disappeared. Create a narrative where Marilyn died alone, nude in her bed, having taken her own life, a narrative that was tragic but contained, that didn't raise questions about who else might have been involved. Several pieces of evidence support the theory that Marilyn's death scene was deliberately staged. There's Sergeant Clemmons' testimony that the bedroom looked too perfect, and that Marilyn's body position looked arranged rather than natural. There's the timeline discrepancy confirmed by Murray. There's the complete absence of a drinking glass, raising the question of how Marilyn could have swallowed 40 to 50 capsules without water. There's the autopsy finding that Marilyn's stomach contained no pill residue despite the supposedly fatal oral overdose. And there's the systematic disappearance of every piece of photographic evidence. Most people who had direct knowledge of what happened to Marilyn Monroe in her final hours are now dead. But before they died, several left hints or made admissions pointing toward a truth different from the official story. Dr. Ralph Greenson never publicly discussed details of that night, citing doctor-patient confidentiality. But in private conversations with colleagues, Greenson made statements suggesting he believed Marilyn had been the victim of foul play. Dr. Arnold Abrams, a psychiatrist who worked with Greenson, stated that Greenson had told him Marilyn was murdered and that powerful people were involved. Greenson died in 1983 without making a public statement. Dr. Noguchi wrote extensively about his famous cases, but his chapter on Marilyn was notably cautious. In late-life interviews, Noguchi acknowledged that there were political pressures that influenced how the case was handled and how findings were presented. He died in 2020. Eunice Murray lived until 2005 and gave increasingly candid interviews as she aged. She hinted at visitors to the house earlier in the evening and suggested one had a confrontation with Marilyn. Murray died months after giving that final interview. Walter Schaefer kept his original incident report until his death in 1991. Before he died, he told his daughter he'd been pressured to change his statement and that what he'd seen didn't match what they wanted the public to believe. Edmond Locard honored his confidentiality agreement for 60 years, but arranged for his sealed testimony to be released after both he and Dr. Noguchi had passed away. That testimony, made available in 2018, confirmed the presence of the pink nightgown, the documentation of injuries later omitted from the official report, the concerning findings about the empty stomach, and the suppression of autopsy photographs. In his testimony, Locard stated, "I believe the official report on Marilyn Monroe's death was deliberately falsified to support a predetermined conclusion. The physical evidence we observed during autopsy was inconsistent with suicide by oral barbiturate ingestion, the injuries we documented suggested recent physical trauma, and the systematic removal of evidence, including the nightgown and the autopsy photographs, indicates a coordinated cover-up by individuals with the authority to manipulate official records and intimidate witnesses." Locard left the medical profession within a year of Marilyn's autopsy, haunted by what he'd witnessed and by his inability to tell the truth without destroying his career and facing criminal prosecution. 62 years after Marilyn Monroe's death, significant portions of the investigation file remain sealed or classified. The coroner's office maintains that certain materials are withheld for privacy and sensitivity reasons, but continues to refuse access even to legitimate researchers. The LAPD has acknowledged that some files were lost or destroyed, but has never provided a satisfactory explanation. The FBI's file on Marilyn has been partially declassified, but hundreds of pages remain redacted. The most logical explanation is that redacted portions contain information about Marilyn's relationships with the Kennedy brothers and potentially about government involvement in the aftermath of her death. So what happened to the pink silk nightgown that Marilyn Monroe was wearing when she died? Based on testimony of multiple witnesses and the pattern of evidence suppression, the most likely scenario is this. Marilyn was discovered unresponsive around midnight on August 4th, wearing the nightgown. She was either already dead or dying. Someone made the decision that the death needed to be managed before law enforcement was notified. During the hours between midnight and 4:25 a.m., when police were finally called, the death scene was staged. Marilyn's nightgown was removed and taken away. Her body was repositioned. The bedroom was cleaned and organized. Any evidence of visitors or struggle was eliminated. When the ambulance crew arrived at 3:50 a.m., some staging had been done, but not all, which is why they saw Marilyn wearing the nightgown. After they left, final staging was completed. By the time Sergeant Clemmons arrived at 4:35 a.m., the scene was perfect. The pink nightgown was removed because forensic analysis would have revealed information that powerful people needed hidden. It might have shown evidence of recent sexual activity, raising questions about who had been with Marilyn. It might have contained fiber evidence, hair evidence, or trace materials linking another person to the scene. It might have contained chemical evidence showing how drugs were introduced, and the very existence of the nightgown contradicted the desired narrative. A woman found nude after taking pills supports a story of solitary despair. A woman found clothed raises different questions. The nightgown was evidence of a different story, so it had to disappear. It was never entered into evidence, never logged despite being photographed during autopsy. It's not in any official storage, not in any private collection. It simply vanished, along with the photographs that documented it, along with original witness statements, along with any forensic analysis. The case files remain sealed, the photographs remain hidden. The witnesses are dead, and the truth about what really happened to Marilyn Monroe on the night of August 4, 1962, remains buried under 60 years of lies, intimidation, and institutional cover-up. But the questions remain, and they demand answers we may never get.